Stan Hieronymus joins me this week to talk about hop aroma oil, survivability, and biotransformations. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 242. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 242, and it's late August 2021. Stan Hieronymus joins me this week to talk about hop aroma oil, survivability, and biotransformations. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the Brew Commander, the new brew house controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brew house controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. Finally, I'm happy to say the new web-based version of BeerSmith is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. The new web-based version gives you access to tens of thousands of recipes, online recipe editing, advanced water tools, and more from any device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up an account at beersmithrecipes.com. And if you already purchased a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version for one low price. Go to beersmithrecipes.com now to give BeerSmith Web a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back Stan Hieronymus. Stan is the author of For the Love of Hops and has authored a number of books including Brewing Local, Brew Like a Monk, and Brew with Wheat. Stan has also penned hundreds of periodicals and is a certified beer judge. Stan, it's great to have you on the show. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am well, my friend. I am well. Let's see. We last had you on about a year ago, and I understand you moved yet again.
We have. We live just outside of Denver now. We're excited for the opportunity to get back on the mountains. Right now, the mountains aren't a great place to be because all that smoke from California wildfires is filling everything up. The air quality is not very good.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Otherwise, the weather's great.
But you're enjoying yourself. The craft beer scene there is pretty good too, right?
It is, but I tell me where it isn't now. It's pretty good everywhere. You know, we just left Atlanta. There's new breweries opening all the time. Breweries doing new interesting things. So there's excellent beer all around.
Good. Well, today you wanted to talk about an interesting topic that really I just started exploring, but it's survivables. So what does survivables mean when we talk about hops and beer?
Well, it's a term. We'll say it's made up by Yakima Chief hops, which is nothing wrong with the idea that it's made up. That they, in doing it, so backing up a moment, as you know, about 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, they introduced the cryo hops.
Sure, I remember that.
And at that time, they began working on with this idea of coming up with an ideal blend of hops, and which is recently released, which was Cryo Pop, which is their blend of hops in the cryo form, meant to be useful. It could be on the hot side, more like at Whirlpool, and throughout the fermentation process, or even post-fermentation.
And I'm trying to remember, the cryo hops are something like lupulin powder. Is that right? Or
they're very slightly different process. So what you have is they did it first in a powder form, and at the commercial level, brewers discovered that the powder was just sitting on top when they dry hopped, and they really wanted to have pellets, so they figured out how to pelletize it. John I. Haas has come up with Lupomax since then, which is in the pellet form. Hopsteiner still sells a lupulin powder. So without getting too deep into how these things are made, um, there is T45s, which people may have heard of, that comes at a really extremely low temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Well, about the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet, which is like -20, something like that. So it's a super cold environment. You freeze it down and you separate out the lupulin. Yakima cheese process is a little bit different, and so I think it may be patented. But in any event, that came out as the cryo hops. They are they cost about twice as much,
Mm-hmm.
but you only have to use half as much, and you don't have the loss that you have with hops. Hops absorb so much beer that dry hopping at the extreme levels that breweries do now is very expensive, and this cuts some of that back.
And these are primarily used on the whirlpool side, or also on dry hopping.
Both.
Both, yeah.
And they also help mitigate against hop creep, because you don't have very much green matter in there, and so it would appear that the enzymes that are responsible for hop creep are in the green matter.
Interesting.
So anyway, in doing this research, they've really expanded their labs, and it allows them to measure many more things. And in the course of that, they looked at practically speaking what ends up in beer, what are the compounds in beer. So when you're buying your hops and they're analyzed, and you can see, and again, you go back just a few years, and all you were going to see is the hydrocarbons, the alpha and the beta, probably the cohumulone, because people consider that important, and the total essential oil, but not what the parts of the essential oil were. Well, those hydrocarbons don't survive the boil. For the most part, they barely survive the boil.
Mm-hmm.
So in looking at that, they wanted to look at compounds that are important for aroma and flavor, and then go back and see, measure how they are, how much of them there are at the outset, and seeing what makes it into beer and is a factor in beer. And they came up with 7. They call those the survivables.
So survival means that, it actually makes it into the final beer, right? Yeah, because
right.
You can actually lose things at each phase, right?
Right. So certainly, boiling, 10 minutes of boiling will eliminate about half of essential oil. I'd say about half, because essential oil is going to be 0.5% up to 4%. That's generally, you're not getting many to do that, of the hop. And then those individual compounds generally are going to be less than 1/10%. Most of them that we care about, for instance, like say linalool. On the other hand, myrcene can be up to 75% of the essential oil,
mm-hmm.
and that's not going to make it out of the boil. But the ones we really care about, say linalool, geraniol, they'll be about half eliminated, like I said, with 10 minutes of boiling. That's why many breweries have gone. They'll make beers where they make their first edition, for instance, maybe in the whirlpool, because you are still going to get isomerization when you do that,
mm-hmm.
and you're preserving more of the essential oil compounds that you want.
Right, and then of course you lose more during fermentation, right?
You lose it during fermentation, the CO2 blow off. Yeast is going to drag some out of suspension, so you continue to lose it all the way along, and that's not always bad, because the whole role of what myrcene plays, for instance, is a question in the aughts. You wanted myrcene in your dry hop beers. You wanted that character of it. Now, I think people recognize some is necessary, but it can also mask a lot of the fruity flavors that people want.
And of course, you lose even more when you get to, filtering, packaging, aging, all these other things, right?
Right.
Um, well, another interesting concept for measuring hops that never caught on was the Aroma Unit, which was introduced some 30 years ago. What's that?
Well, so this was it was as a matter of fact just credits. So Gail Nickerson at Oregon State University and Earl Van Engel at Blitz Weinard Brewery, and this week, that Blitz Weinard was sold a long time ago. The brand is bounced around with different breweries and things like that. And the last Weinhardt product, Weinhardt Reserve, Miller Coors just announced they're discontinuing it, so it sort of goes out of history. But in the early '90s, and this is kind of a precursor to thinking about um, that you can have certain numbers up front that don't mean anything at the back end. And what they recognized was when you're looking at these compounds, you should look at the ones that end up in the beer. And and at the time, of course, people to have their beer consistent, you had the IBU, International Bitterness Units.
Right.
And they proposed an aroma unit. So recognizing that you would have variation from year to year of certain key compounds. And so you could make it consistent. So let's, step back in time almost 30 years. People are making a pale ale, generally not dry hopped. Maybe 3 hop additions at the beginning of the boil, late in the boil, and perhaps at knockout. And sometimes actually with 20 minutes to go and 10 minutes to go. So they're constantly boiling off those compounds. But in any event, to be consistent, you get your Cascade one year and the alpha acids are 7%, and you get them another year, they're 5%. That's why you want IBU, so you can measure and have the same bitterness from year to year.
Right.
And what they said is you understand that those key compounds are going to vary from year to year, and you should adjust them in the same way. So they identified 22 compounds, none of which were thiols. And now we understand how important the thiols are the sulfur compounds.
Right.
And they broke them into 3 categories, which were oxidation products, floral estery, and citrus spicy. And they would measure those, put those together for one number, and that way you could, there were the aroma units, and you could adjust your hops. Of course, then it becomes tricky because now you're trying to adjust for IBU and you're trying to adjust for AU. And for a variety of reasons, some breweries tried it, were very satisfied. For the most part, they didn't think it made a difference. In New Zealand, this attracted more attention, and until recently, the New Zealand hops, when they would provide information for you, they would tell you what the floral estery number was for that hop variety and what the citrus spicy was. So before breweries were providing as much information as they do now, which would be, say, the amount of linalool. Of course, that's an average amount for, we'll say you're buying Citra hops. You're getting that for Citra that year, not that specific lot, which can vary. But so that information was really useful to have with, say, the New Zealand hops, which almost nobody used anyway. But in a way, it was a precursor for thinking about survivables.
Well, now we know that there's some 1,000 hop compounds or so, and only a small number of those are aroma and actually survive the whole thing. What are some of the ones that are important today?
Well, of their 7. First off, I mentioned there are some that can be important that aren't in every hop.
Right.
Which is why you're thinking about using different hop varieties. And how they come about, their sources aren't exactly clear. You can take like beta hudamol, which is an Aromas hops, which is a French hop, and is a daughter of Strisselspalt. And it basically, it's just identified as it adds a soothing quality.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes when you get a full measure of the hop and you realize that it's always going to provide that, it's particularly for people making IPAs right now, which is almost everybody. That's just kind of a sideshow. And then there are the things that scientists are still trying to sort out, like another French hop, Barbe Rouge, has this, when you use it, particularly basically in a dry hop, probably during fermentation, it gets a real strawberry note. And right now, scientists don't know why. So, that's something we want to sort out. In terms of the high profile compounds that people are interested in, then linalool and geraniol are at the top of the list. And in both a good way and a bad way, scientists have understood this for a long time. Linalool is, it's like in the 70s. Certainly, breeders and brewers started to focus on linalool. They understood that was an important compound in terms of saying this beer is hoppy. When it has a pretty high level of linalool, people go, that has that hop quality that we're looking for. And there was a great focus that, like, we want linalool as opposed to geraniol, which is another. So both of those are monoterpene alcohols.
Mm-hmm.
So they will survive. They're lost some in boiling, but they can work their way through the brewing process, and therefore they're survivables. Geraniol, which, as its name would imply, smells somewhat like geraniums. It can have a citrus note, important compound in Cascade. So in the early 70s, when Cascade was first released, as you know, it was around a long time. No brewers were committed to it. It was the breeder Al Honnold, who was actually not the original breeder, but he wanted to get it out into the public,
Mm-hmm.
and there just wasn't interest in it. And you have some disasters in Europe, and so the quote noble hops were expensive or not possible to get, and Coors committed to Cascade.
Mm-hmm.
And to buy it multiple years and to pay $1 a pound for it, which at the time was an outlandish amount. And that's what kickstarted Cascade. And the large breweries in the country who were making pale lagers that were not beers that were particularly hop aromatic started using this hop. And after a couple of years, they're going, whoa, there's something going on here we don't like. And Honnold immediately identified it was the geraniol. So we went through a period where breeders were trying to breed varieties that did not have geraniol.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're back to understanding that geraniol is an important component, for the biotransformations that take place during the brewing process. And when you talk about the survivables, in some cases, in two cases, geraniol and linalool are two of those 7, and they're really important in they need to be in contact with yeast, because yeast creates these other compounds. And that's another thing to think about. Survivables is you're not necessarily focused on, although in the case of linalool, it does continue to add aroma, quote, hoppy aroma, but it's also that it can be transformed during the brewing process. The same with geraniol. You can smell the geraniol. So if you're using it dry hopping with a hop that's high in geraniol, you're still going to get the geraniol character as well, but it can be transformed into citronellal, which is more lime and citrusy.
Well, we're coming around to the Yakima research, which they put out this thing called the Survivable Compounds Handbook, which I'll put in the show notes. Can you talk a little bit about what they've done? I know you've already talked a little bit about the 7, for example. Can you talk a little about what they've done and what the handbook has?
Well, what the handbook is, and of course it's varieties that their farmers grow,
Mm-hmm.
which are their, I think, 50, it's a family owned, but there's a total of about 55 farms that grow hops for Yakima Chief or are partial owners. And certainly there are other hops out there. But so the two things is you get the research that they've done. A lot of times research is either by large breweries who share some stuff and maybe don't share some other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or at academic institutions. And it is that certain caution you have in publishing. And Yakima Chief is just sharing this, making some suggestions, which makes it easier for brewers to understand. So you can look at their research, but you can also extrapolate. And quite honestly, because I've seen so many presentations about this, I sometimes forget what's in the book and what isn't in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So, for one thing, they look through the process and say, these are the varieties high in geraniol, just listing the geraniol. And at some point, they have Bravo in there, which is actually was Hopsteiner bred that hop.
Mm-hmm.
Other farmers grow it as well. But that would be an example. It isn't in their high survivables list, and it isn't necessarily contain a lot of those compounds, but it is super high in geraniol. So if you want to use something like that in a blend, but I think the important part of this is first you see that one chart, which is what people are going to look at from high to low. And I think on the 2020 crop, the highest hop is Centennial. And then second is the Cryopop blend.
Mm-hmm.
And third might be Idaho 7. And you can look at that. And part of the point is these hops should be used, are very useful used early in the process because
Right.
they are going to survive, not necessarily maybe late in the boil or at the whirlpool stage. And the ones on the right-hand side, which would include hops like Cashmere and Azaka, they are not high in survivables. So if you want to get the quality of that hop, then you want to use it probably post-fermentation. So that's a useful part of the chart. But there's another part. So if you look at the Centennial in their chart, for instance, you see that it's got really high in methyl geraniate, and that will give you that nice fruity floral ester, and it's high in geraniol. That geraniol is going to be converted into other compounds as well. It's also high in 3MH, which is 3-mercaptohexanol, and it's one of the more prominent diols. And those interact, on its own, it can smell tropical guava, grapefruit, but that is pronounced when it interacts with a combination of, say, linalool, geraniol, and citronellal, and that's when you get those more tropical flavors. 3MH is not in that many hop varieties
Mm-hmm.
in a free form. So if you're using Citra, for instance, that has a lot of 4-MMP, which is 4-mercaptohexanol 1, whatever. Anyway, we just call it 4-MMP. And that gives you, again, a tropical aroma and flavor. That's in a free form. So the yeast do not need to interact with that. That there are many more bound thiols in hops than there are free thiols in hops, and particularly 3MH. I'm not sure when, because of the way YCH is measuring the 3MH, how much free 3MH there is, not much, I think. So you want to be able to free those bound thiols, and right now, beer yeast is not good at that.
Interesting.
And so the idea is if you have something that is 3MH bound thiols, you want to put it with an enzyme that will free it. So there are a couple of new yeast strains out there now. And one of them is Tropics from Berkeley, and then Cosmic Punch from Omega. And people will go back and forth if we want to use these because they're created with CRISPR or something close to CRISPR, which is, of course, a way of genetic modification. In the case of Cosmic Punch, for sure, they can sell that in the United States without calling it GMO because they're simply taking a gene from one yeast strain, which is good at creating that enzymatic activity, putting it into another strain of theirs, which is a hazy strain, and their most popular strain, doing some other ordering of the DNA, but not introducing anything from the outside to create that. So getting to 3MH is another step, and certainly 3MH is an important part of the thiols. And did I wander off track enough there?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Going back to Yakima, though, so they have a nice chart that helps you target at least some of their varieties, right? Or
right,
for different phases.
Are the popular varieties.
Right, for different phases of the thing. Can we sort of generalize that and talk about how we may be able to target aroma oil content? For some aroma oils, for example, are going to survive much better than others.
Oh yeah, without a doubt, and I think, and just particularly talking to commercial breweries, that they're missing the point that the ones on the left side of the chart work well throughout the process. So Citra, you can use that in the whirlpool, and you're still going to get a lot of its qualities, as opposed to the ones on the right-hand side, as I pointed out for, like Azaka and Kashmir. Then you're not going to get much by adding them early in the process, and you're going to lose a lot more.
Right.
When you use those early in the process, you're still going to lose some of the qualities that, or some of the characteristics rather, that those hops contribute. So it's not to say that you are locked to the left side using Citra. You might use that early. You might use it at whirlpool. You might use it, say, at the beginning of fermentation. But you could still decide to use some post-fermentation when it's not going to change. So when you smell a hop, that's not necessarily what you're going to get in the beer unless you add it right at the end of the process. So what you're going to see more of, and I'm not sure how, at the homebrew level, it's much more difficult.
Right.
Are distilled oils. And certainly in the commercial, the appeal of the distilled oils is you can get what you're smelling. You don't get green matter, so hop creep isn't much of an issue. They last longer. Again, anecdotally at least, and it's a hard thing to prove, beers made with the distilled oils have a longer shelf life. So there are many appeals to those.
And I have seen some of those in the homebrew level even. I've seen people come in with drops, and you put a couple drops in the beer.
Exactly what you need is at the drop level. And then being sure what you get, because some conjecture, thiols are the shiny new toy. Yeah. And they're really hard to measure, and expensive to measure. And therefore, some of the people doing this can't assure you what you're getting. I talked to one actual, Charles Denby at Berkeley Yeast, which does tropics, and he suggested that process of distilling, but there are many different processes of distilling. You could lose free thiols, but bound thiols would remain. In other cases, the people doing this process say, "Oh no, we're whatever's in that hop is still going to be in the oil." And a key thing about that is that means compounds that would be lost during the brewing process are going to be there at the end when you add it in the oil. And the same thing would be true of the raw hop as opposed to, say, cryopop or something like that. And anything you're adding at the end, which means that you're going to get a boatload of myrcene, which might mask the other aromas and flavors. So
and myrcene,
there's lots of messing around.
Myrcene was kind of interesting. One of the articles you sent me explained why myrcene is really better to use in dry hop if you want the myrcene flavor.
Well, if you want the myrcene flavor, it's going to be. So again, you can go back to the late 90s when people were starting to use, when Simcoe was still a number. And the suggestion was that you open your bag the day before to blow off the myrcene. And then you look in the mid-aughts and you want that myrcene, that green quality, that dankness.
Kind of a piney green flavor, right? Aroma.
Right. So you want a bunch of that. That means you needed to use it as a dry hop. And I think the lesson there is you should figure out where you want to end up, and then how you're going to get there, and how these compounds change during the brewing process.
I mean, for example, you were talking about linalool and geraniol. I assume you really want those in during fermentation, right? In many cases, to get that biotransformation.
Exactly. So you get those, and we talked about this before, the Japanese research. So linalool and geraniol, and I just recently read a paper that suggested it's actually something else that's responsible for the creation of citronellal. In any event, we know it can be a mistake to have something happen and then say, this is what caused it to happen. Maybe that wasn't the cause. But we know you put linalool and the geraniol together in the presence of yeast, we get citronellal. Maybe their markers and other stuff's tugging along with them, but we know that works. And the Japanese, which they would actually cut, and then they call it an LGC mix. And they've actually, rather than doing that within hops, they then take raw linalool, geraniol, and citronellal and blend that with 4-MMP. When you add the 4-MMP, that's when you get tropical, and you get the other fruity complexity and the fruitiness. So the other, the 7 survival compounds are geraniol, linalool, then the 3-MH we talked about. And then there are 3 esters in there, and then there are a ketone, which is just another chemical. It's a definition of the way the compound is held together. And they're, add small amounts of fruitiness along the way. And that's the big thing about hops. Back in the early 90s, they identified 400 compounds in hops. Now we know there are closer to 1,000.
Right.
Most of those are below threshold level, but together they can create a new odor compound, which then our noses turn into aroma.
Now, separately, you sent me an article on recent research into thiols, and you've been talking about thiols virtually the whole show,
Right.
and fruity flavors. What is some of the latest research into thiols, and sort of how do they interact with everything we've been talking about?
Well, right now, the thrust in research is trying to find a way to free bound thiols and find yeast varieties that are more likely to do it.
Now, so talk about that free versus bound.
Okay,
thiols,
bound. I mean, or you can say the precursors there.
Yeah.
Either way, it's in the hop. So like glycosides you've got a sugar molecule, and it's attached to water.
Uh-huh.
And when that's freed, that when they're separated, that frees the odor compound.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your goal. It's the same thing with the thiol, is to free the odor compound. And there's some conjecture exactly about which enzyme does this. And so Tropics is taking the enzyme that does this from some other food, what do they call that? Food quality. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, it's a nice, safe source. It's a yeast strain.
Okay.
In the case of Cosmic Punch, they're using their hazy strain. It's basically a form of London 3, I think. Maybe not London. There are a bunch of things that are like London 3 out there. But the active gene is in Chico yeast. So they're taking that yeast, that gene, plopping it into their yeast, then it gets in, then they are sort of reorganizing. So you need something to promote it, to say, hey, do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that sits in there, and that will free the compound. And now the thiol is available.
So basically, if we free the thiols, what does that do for the overall aroma of the beer?
Well, then you've got the same thing as you have with, say, 4-MMP, which can be tropical. If you have too much 4-MMP, of course, it will smell like cat urine. So it's not necessarily, you can overdo Citra. So that'd be an example. You get more hops that give you the punch, like Citra, Mosaic, and so on. There are still other thiols that are, something's going on that makes Sabro.
Mm-hmm.
That would be an example. Sabro, which of course can become overwhelmingly coconut.
So, what are some of the ways that brewers can really capitalize on these biotransformations, the thiols, and the other compounds that we've been talking about, to sort of make, sort of maximize their hop aroma?
Well, then you get into, and people are all over the place on this. When do you make your dry hop additions?
Mm-hmm.
Is it at the beginning of fermentation, which seems to work well? And is there any real value in making multiple additions during the process? So, doing one early because you're getting a certain quality, and maybe you're eliminating myrcene, for instance, and then later on you're adding something else and eliminating myrcene. An important thing about that, which I think I've alluded to, but is masking. Mm-hmm. That's where you've got that aroma there, or those odor compounds there. But you're not perceiving them because they're masked by something else, masked by this other flavor.
Right.
So I think in terms of what brewers can do is to find what works means lots of experimenting with the different times and taking good notes, which I talked about before. So you go, I did it this way this time, and this worked. And then make one change at a time. Maybe it's the time of your second edition. And you end up with a list of what works. Do not assume that you understand exactly why it worked. That's one of the mistakes we're making right now, is thinking, okay, we've got this figured out, because we pretty well determined in the last 20, 25 years that when we think we have it figured out, we don't have it figured out.
So, what are the main takeaways for homebrewers on survivals, biotransformations, trying to come up with better hop schedules?
Well, there are two. So first, if you're making the beer for me, and we're talking about IPAs, obviously,
right?
it probably needs to be more bitter than you're making it.
Hmm.
So don't forget bitterness. That and therefore it's okay to use a little bit of those hops in the boil or something lower alpha. So you've got some of those other characters in the boil.
Right.
In other words, the very best juicy, hazy IPAs, I probably don't appreciate. So I come with this bias. You're going to use some at the end of the boil or whirlpool or whatever, or hop stand. Hop stands are very good. So you want to put some compounds in there that can interact with the yeast. And the beginning of fermentation is a good time again to interact with the yeast. Both of those you're going to lose compounds because yeast is bubbling along. The CO2 is going to blow out. So another addition makes sense. When as a home brewer, unless you're going to totally drop your yeast out, you're going to continue to get biotransformations with that last addition. A small amount. You've still got yeast there to interact with.
Right.
But for the most part, you're going to come much closer to the raw hop. So if you want what that hop is like, and if you grow your own hops, or if you have the opportunity to go to places where they grow hops, and that's a larger part of the country right now, you should go into a hop field 2 or 3 weeks before harvest and rub the cones then. And you begin to understand how much changes in the hop itself in those last 2 to 3 weeks. And so it's an ongoing process. And what you're doing is just picking up that ongoing process that's there. Those compounds continue to change. And because they continue to change, that's why you want to understand when when you want to use them.
Well, Stan, obviously a complicated subject. Really appreciate you being here to walk us through some of the complexities of this topic.
Well, so the latest, so to move on, and particularly of interest to homebrewers who want access to these hops.
Sure.
And a month ago, you might be aware of that heat dome that settled in over the Northwest, and they're also getting hammered with heat this week.
Okay.
But that one at the end of June was really hard on some hop varieties, and particularly the baby hops, and it was looking like there could be a shortfall of citra yield. The last month has been a lot better. A lot of the hops are really good at recovering. So things are looking better now. That as homebrewers, you're thinking, do I have access to the hops? How much do they cost me? And what quality am I going to get? So you like the idea that there are going to be more varieties out there, and they're going to be in the public domain. Citra and Mosaic, and many others, were privately developed. That was expensive. And particularly at the time, and they're still recouping some of that cost in developing them.
Right.
They're going to be more, the public hop breeding program is back in full swing. And additionally, the Hop Quality Group, which is about 55 breweries, I think, are members of now. Don't quote me on that number. They are also financing research into hop breeding and new varieties. And right now, all of the varieties that would move forward in that Hop Quality Group thing are being checked for thiols along the way. So there's going to be more interesting hops available. Both just you're able to get them, probably able to get them at an okay price.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to certainly having more hop access. And Stan, I'd like to thank you again for coming on the show. It's great having you as a guest.
Thank you.
So my guest today was Stan Hieronymus, the author of the books For the Love of Hops, Brew Like a Monk, and Brewing Local. Stan, thanks again. Take care.
Okay.
A big thank you to Stan Hieronymus for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brew house controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric, gas, propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brew house controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, go to blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And I'm happy to say the new web-based version of BeerSmith is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days for free by setting up an account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version for one low price. Check out beersmithrecipes.com to give it a try today. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.